The Chernobyl nuclear power plant disaster is one of the most well-known and interesting stories in modern history. But there are many hidden details, stories, and secrets that still remain unknown to most people today. Number 10. The 1986 disaster is the first thing that comes to mind for most people when talking about accidents at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. But the meltdown at Reactor 4 wasn't the only accident to take place at the facility, and it wasn't even the last. Shortly after the 5th anniversary of the accident that changed Chernobyl forever, another accident threatened another catastrophe. Since 1986, 3 of Chernobyl's 4 reactors had remained online. They were not damaged in the disaster, and were far enough away from the wreckage of Reactor 4 for plant operators to consider it safe for work to continue. By 1991, though, plant workers had noticed a problem with one of the turbines. Each reactor at Chernobyl was attached to 2 turbines, which were all housed in the same turbine hall. Steam from the reactors would be sent through pipes to the hall, spinning turbines which then generated electricity, which was sent to the power grid. Turbine 4, which was attached to Reactor 2, had developed a problem. On October 11th, technicians set about testing the turbine. It was detached from the reactor and from the electrical grid. Reactor 2 was powered down to just 70% power, but stayed operating and sent steam to Turbine 3. The turbine was slowly coasting down, but it hadn't completely come to a stop when something strange happened. An electrical fault caused the breaker that disconnected the turbine from the grid to reconnect. Suddenly, power started to be sent from the electrical grid to the turbine, accelerating it from 100 revolutions a minute to 3,000 in just 30 seconds. The speed and energy caused wires to heat up and sent electricity arcing through the air. Hydrogen and oils were leaking from the turbine. When the electricity touched the oil, a fire began. Firefighters reacted quickly, trying to control the blaze and stop it from spreading to any of the other turbines. At first, they weren't too concerned about the fire reaching the roof. All the flammable material that sat on top of the roof had been removed after the 1986 disaster. But there were other parts of the structure that were not as fireproof as the staff believed. Structures holding up part of the roof collapsed, sending the material down into the area below. This not only houses the turbines, but also the feed water pumps that were connected to the reactor. While the firefighters tried to control the blaze, the power plant staff tried to simultaneously cut off the turbine, while also making sure that the reactor didn't overheat. Each time the turbine was disconnected, the breaker would reconnect again. It was only when a remote breaker was activated that the turbine was finally kept offline. Thankfully, there was a condensate pump that had narrowly been avoided by being damaged by the roof collapse. It had never been used for feed water, but plumbers connected this to the feed water system and hoped it would be enough to stop the reactor from going into a meltdown. It would work, and the reactor cooled off enough for it to be safely shut down, preventing a repeat of what had happened just 5 years earlier. Number 9. Even while the cleanup effort was still underway, figuring out exactly what happened in the moments leading up to 1:23 a.m. was a top priority for Soviet officials and for scientists working with nuclear power around the world. The first investigation into the disaster found that human error was largely at fault, but further investigation into the design of the RBMK reactor, especially after the fall of the Soviet Union, revealed serious design flaws that made some kind of accident almost inevitable. What everyone agrees on now, though, is that the triggering moment was the one when a single button in the control room was pressed. Where that button is today is a mystery. AZ-5 was one of a number of emergency buttons in the control room. This was the button responsible for lowering the control rods into the reactor to slow down or stop the nuclear fission from taking place. The outside of the control rods was made from boron, a material that absorbed neutrons. This stopped them from colliding with radioactive atoms and causing the atom to break apart. But there was a second part of the control rod. The interior of the rod was made from graphite, a moderator that actually accelerates the reaction. This interior part of the rod telescopes out from the exterior. When the rods are completely raised, this is the final part to leave the reactor. When the rods are lowered again, it it's the first part to touch the radioactive material before the boron casing slides over the top. Under normal circumstances, this doesn't cause too many problems, but the moments leading up to 1:23 a.m. were far from normal. Due to mistakes that had taken place the day before, the reactor was now losing power. The team tried to combat this by removing control rods. The power suddenly surged. When they realized their mistakes, one of the men in the control room ordered AZ-5 to be pressed. The rods were lowered, the graphite displaced the water, and the reaction suddenly accelerated. In an instant, the reactor became so hot that the fuel melted, making it impossible for the rest of the control rods to be lowered. Staff tried to make the boron fall manually, but there was nothing that could be done, with the melted fuel now blocking the channels. All they could do was get out. There's plenty of speculation about AZ-5 and the consequences of pressing it. Some have wondered whether not pressing the button would have been the right choice, but this was supposed to be the safety shutoff button. Others have theorized that the button may have been pressed twice, momentarily stopping the lowering for just long enough for the reaction to grow out of control. Number 8 was just how slow the reaction was to warn those living nearby. Officials did not want to cause alarm, and it wasn't until over a day later that the nearby city of Pripyat was evacuated forever. In the time between the disaster and the city being evacuated, some film footage was captured showing life continuing as normal, even as firefighters worked to tackle the nearby disaster. This footage is often attributed to Valery Yevtushenko. Yevtushenko was a senior criminal investigator living in the town of Chernobyl at the time of the disaster. About a year before, he'd been transferred to Pripyat for work, where he made a happy discovery. The station had access to film cameras, something Yevtushenko was incredibly interested in. He'd studied the arts at school and wanted to put his creative side to good use. Over the next year, he connected with a circle of amateur filmmakers and photographers, including their leader, Mikhail Nazarenko. He made films primarily about the activities of the police to show citizens what they were doing. One of these was shot a few weeks before the disaster and was screened for the first time on April 26th. Yevtushenko was warned of the Chernobyl disaster just a few hours after it had begun and rushed to Pripyat to begin work. He filmed a little footage that morning, but his main focus was on taking notes of radiation levels at the various police stations. The next day, he was sent to the power plant itself to take photos. Officials wanted to see images of the plant in relation to Pripyat and the other inhabited areas in order to determine whether they needed to be evacuated. Yevtushenko was one of the photographers who flew over the plant in a helicopter, taking snapshots of the wreckage and the scenes surrounding it. He returned to Pripyat shortly before the evacuation orders were announced. Buses had been arranged to pick up civilians and take them to a safe location. According to the announcements, they would only be away for a short time, and they were told to bring only enough food to last a few days. The buses were to leave at 2 p.m., leaving little time for Yevtushenko to develop his photos. This was quickly done, but he sadly discovered that only a handful of them were useful. After the evacuation, he filmed more. By now, the streets were almost entirely empty of people. Sanitation workers sprayed down the streets, and pigeons played in puddles of water left behind, but there were few civilians to be seen. It was in stark contrast to footage taken just the day before. Number 7. Most people with an interest in the Chernobyl disaster will know of the Duga radar system, or the Russian woodpecker. But this was not the only military installation that had to be abandoned after the nuclear meltdown of 1986. Just a few kilometers away is another radar array, even more mysterious than Duga, that most people have never heard of. The site sits roughly 2 kilometers to the southwest of the Duga array, down a road that's largely overgrown today. Today it doesn't look like much. It's a clearing in the forest with a small military building in the center. Piles of scrap metal have been collected and forgotten. Inside the building, most of the equipment has been removed. In the flooded basement, a few books have been left behind, along with a board featuring photos of Soviet officials. This is all that remains of the Krug ionosphere research station. Krug means circle in Russian, and this is clearly seen from above. In the foliage that's taken over the exclusion zone, a circle is clearly visible in satellite images. There was once an array of antennas that made up the circumference of this circle, roughly 200 meters in diameter. What exactly the ionosphere research station did is a mystery. There are many Krug systems that operated around the USSR. According to a declassified CIA document, many of these were used to help intercept communications from Western satellites, although it's unlikely this was the purpose of the Chernobyl array. In theory, it was designed to research the ionosphere, the uppermost layer of the atmosphere. Some believe it had a similar purpose to Duga, or at least that it helped to assist Duga. The Duga radar system was an over-the-horizon radar. It was designed to detect intercontinental weapons being launched in the direction of Europe. To do this, radars would be bounced off the atmosphere at an angle that directed them beyond the horizon, allowing Duga to detect objects beyond its line of sight. The theory suggests that the Krug radar system was researching the ionosphere to help with this. It may have been experimenting to learn how these radio waves interacted with the upper atmosphere, or how the Duga system could be more effective. Number 6. In April of 2020, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant was in the news again, as people around the world feared another disaster was imminent. While authorities in Ukraine were able to get the situation under control quickly, the person who lit a series of fires that burned through the exclusion zone remains a mystery. Forest fires in or near the Chernobyl exclusion zone are nothing new. Some of these are caused by careless tourists or people starting campfires that then grow out of control. But the traditional practice of burning dry grass to clear land has become an increasing problem. People living near the exclusion zone might burn the fields to make way for new growth, with the belief that this will make the soil more nutrient-rich for whatever grows there next. Unfortunately, these fires can grow out of control. Rising temperatures and increase in vegetation within the exclusion zone have made these fires even more common in recent years, but nothing compared to April of 2020. Huge swaths of the Chernobyl exclusion zone burned in only a few weeks. Villages that had been abandoned after 1986 were burned to the ground, while others had to be evacuated. Roughly 870 square kilometers were burned, about a third of the entire exclusion zone, and the flames came dangerously close to the most radioactive parts of the area. Exactly how close to the power plant the fires reached isn't clear, though some sources state that it came within 1.2 miles of the nuclear reactors and the storage facility. Pripyat was also untouched but came dangerously close to being burned. Either of these could have been disastrous to the surrounding environment. As firefighters tried to get the blazes under control, people in Ukraine and around the world wondered what this meant for the radioactive isotopes that still sit in the soil of the Red Forest and the surrounding areas. The fires were sending thick smog southwards to the capital of Kiev, forcing people to keep their windows shut. Early in the emergency, there were reports of higher than normal levels of radiation within the fire, but thankfully this didn't seem to spread outside of the area that was burning. There was no rise in radioactivity levels in Kiev or any of the other populated areas of Ukraine. Helicopters, planes, and hundreds of firefighters were sent into the exclusion zone to put out the fires. In just 2 weeks, the flames had been extinguished, and scientists in the region began to study the effects of this new disaster. In the months and years that followed, new scientific articles would be published. There was a possibility that the fires had released isotopes that could more easily be washed into the prior river, but scientists couldn't be certain that this was the case. But what they did find was that even if the river itself became more contaminated, this was quickly diluted as the water flowed out of the area. It would take much longer to figure out exactly what impact this had on the wildlife of the exclusion zone, but the traditional impact of a forest fire seemed to be a bigger threat than any increases in radioactivity. Number 5. For the past 40 years, some of the most haunting and chilling photos ever taken have come from the Chernobyl exclusion zone. The abandoned towns and even the power plant itself have become a window into a world without humans. But some of these photos leave people with more questions than answers, especially when seemingly ordinary things appear in the most unordinary of places. There are plenty of examples throughout Pripyat and other tourist locations of people deliberately staging things for a creepy photo. These include baby dolls and other toys posed with gas masks, but these usually aren't all that mysterious. Going closer to the heart of the disaster, though, there's one extremely unsettling photo. It was taken by Alexander Kupny, a physics technician. In 1989, Kupny was part of a team that ventured into the wreckage of Unit 4 to take photos of what remained. Among the photos of broken pipes and destroyed rooms was one of a simple, plain wooden chair lying in the reactor hall. The reactor hall was left severely damaged by the blast. Photos taken inside the room resemble something from a war zone, with collapsed parts of the building mixed with pipes and broken parts of the reactor system. Parts of the cleanup effort are also clearly visible. Decontamination glue colors the wreckage a yellow-brown, while the remains of parachutes used to drop material to smother the reactor still hang or are draped over the wreckage. Kupny explains that as he moved from the reactor shaft to a door leading to the refueling machine operator's room, he took this photo of the chair. It sits among the wreckage and parachute parts, undamaged but clearly out of place. According to Kupny, neither he nor anybody else knows how the chair even got there. Before the disaster, similar chairs could be found in the refueling machine's operator room, and may have been the origins of this red chair. One theory is that it was far enough from the blast that it was undamaged in the accident, but the force of the blast caused it to be moved and fall into the hole. Another theory is that it was thrown there by a person, possibly to move it out of the way. According to Kupny, the area where the chair was located has an extremely high radiation level, reaching 100 roentgens per hour. Radiation workers are supposedly supposed to be limited to just 40 in a year. Unless someone comes forward as the person responsible for moving this chair, it's unlikely the mystery of that red chair will ever be definitively solved. But it's far from the only ordinary artifact in a strange location that can be found at Chernobyl. In the earliest photos of the elephant's foot, a strange object can be seen on the left side of the image. The elephant's foot is the most famous piece of corium in the world. The melted parts of the reactor core eventually solidified into a mass, which earned the strange nickname due to its shape. Just a few feet from where the elephant's foot came to rest, a mop was standing upright. It's believed that the mop was located there before the disaster, left behind by a worker who assumed he'd be returning to duty like normal on April 26th. By the time the corium reached this point, it was relatively cool, and the mop itself was unharmed. It's chilling to see the two objects together. One represents ordinary, everyday work at the power plant, while the other has become one of the most well-known relics of the catastrophe. Number 4. In the days, weeks, and even years after the disaster, families were evacuated from homes that they would never see again. But this wasn't the first time people had been removed from their homes due to the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Long before Chernobyl or Pripyat, there were villages that occupied the area. One of these was Nagortsi, the remains of which leave a chilling sight for visitors venturing close to the plant. When officials decided to build a new nuclear power plant, there were a few things they needed to consider when deciding on a location. It needed to have a good road and rail connections to the outside world, as well as a water source for cooling facilities. But such a location would inevitably be highly populated, so the officials looked for an area that would be unsuitable for agriculture. This would make it less likely for people to be living there, and would limit the damage the site would do to Ukraine's agricultural output. An area along the Pripyat River seemed perfect. It had the road and rail connections, and the river itself would be able to cool the plant. It wasn't too highly populated, but there were still people living there. Among the small hamlets and villages was Nagortsi. Nagortsi at the time had a population of 248 people. It was a small community, but this was a place where people had lived their entire lives for generations. It was served by a small cemetery, which included a monument to those who'd lost their lives in the Great Patriotic War, or World War II. The loss of Nagortsi and these other small settlements was decided to be worth it for the power plant. The village was evacuated, with people resettling nearby. The buildings were then destroyed as construction work began on the cooling pond. All that was left untouched was the cemetery. The cooling pond at Chernobyl relied on water being pumped from the river. It was a crucial part of the facility and remained in use even after the 1986 disaster. It was also home to a fish farm and a few other amenities. But when the final reactor at Chernobyl was shut down, there was no more use for the pond. The pumps were turned off, and the water levels gradually started to drop. The cemetery was once directly on the shore of the cooling pond, making an unsettling scene for anybody who might stumble across it. Today, many of the graves lie deeper into the woods as the trees and vegetation have reclaimed the area. Cemeteries in other parts of the exclusion zone are relatively well kept. The areas are maintained by officials and by family members, who are allowed to come visit the graves of loved ones on special occasions. But judging by photos taken of Nagortsi, this hasn't been the case here. The cemetery is still highly radioactive, likely due to its location on the shores of a pond where radioactive material was dumped after the disaster. Number 3. Anatoly Dyatlov is possibly the most famous name associated with the Chernobyl nuclear power plant disaster. But despite the cemetery where Dyatlov was buried being known today, the exact location of his grave is kept a secret from most. This is due to the controversy surrounding his responsibility for the catastrophe. Dyatlov was the deputy chief engineer at Chernobyl at the time of the disaster, and one of the most senior people at the entire plant. He'd been born in Siberia and left school at an early age before training as an electrician. Dyatlov would eventually study at the Moscow Engineering and Physics Institute, graduating in 1959 and beginning a career in nuclear engineering. After working for several years installing nuclear engines in submarines, he began working at Chernobyl, slowly rising through the ranks. Dyatlov is remembered in the media today as a harsh boss who shouted at his subordinates. Those who worked with him knew him as someone who didn't accept carelessness or negligence, but could be understanding if mistakes were made for explainable reasons. He expected people to be competent, but also strove to better himself too. Dyatlov did not get on with people he did not consider experts in the field, including the chief engineer at Chernobyl, and he wasn't one to say something he didn't agree with for political reasons. On the night of the disaster, Dyatlov was the most senior person on site. He was in the Unit 4 control room, monitoring the situation. According to the first official investigation into the disaster, Dyatlov treated his staff badly that night, pressuring them to go against safety protocol and arguing with those who refused. This part of the story has been carried through to modern interpretations of Dyatlov's character, but nobody in the control room saw any of these arguments. None even heard any raised voices until after the meltdown had occurred. When things did go wrong, Dyatlov did make some mistakes. He ordered 2 engineers to go manually lower the control rods into the reactor. He quickly realized this mistake, but when he went to call them back, they'd already disappeared. But when Dyatlov realized the extent of the danger, he ordered anybody not critical to leave and tried to express to the authorities just how bad the situation at Chernobyl was. Dyatlov would be taken to the hospital with radiation sickness. He had burns to his legs that were so bad that he would have to learn to walk again. He partially recovered, but would face a trial that accused him of being the main person responsible for the disaster. As well as bullying his subordinates, Dyatlov was accused of ignoring safety regulations that would have stopped the catastrophe from happening. Dyatlov argued that while he might have some responsibility, he was following orders that had been given to him by more senior officials, and that ultimately it was design flaws with the reactor that caused things to go so wrong. Despite his arguments, though, Dyatlov was found guilty of criminal negligence and sentenced to 10 years in prison. He would serve only 5 before being released due to his ill health. Dyatlov's own belief would never change, and later investigations would reveal that human factors were only contributing factors to the disaster. But even as it became clearer to experts that Dyatlov was not the villain of the Chernobyl story, the wider public was less likely to believe this. Dyatlov passed away in 1995 from complications related to bone marrow cancer. He was buried in a cemetery in Kiev, Ukraine. As he remains a controversial figure, even today, The precise location of his grave is kept a secret to stop any vandalism. Number 2. Scattered around the Chernobyl exclusion zone, close to the power plant itself, are the decaying remains of robots that were once some of the most advanced machines on the planet. Buryakivka is the final resting place of many of these machines, including the now famous Joker robot. As cleanup at Chernobyl got underway, coordinators were faced with the nearly impossible challenge of balancing speed and safety. Getting the wreckage of Unit 4 covered as fast as possible would make sure the health impact on the wider world was limited, but it would inevitably mean putting at risk the lives of the people actually conducting the cleanup. Another added factor was the pressure to get Unit 3 back up and running as quickly as possible. Debris from the Unit 4 reactor had ended up on the roof of its neighbor and needed to be cleared off before Unit 4 could be sealed away. At first, robots seemed like the perfect solution to the challenge presented. It was believed they could do the work of the human cleanup personnel quickly, and all without putting anybody at risk. Robots were brought in from across the Soviet Union and even the West. West Germany and the United States both sent robots to try to help with the cleanup effort. These robots were usually designed to handle the most extreme conditions. Some were able to maneuver in even the most rugged terrain, with at least one robot designed to be operated underwater and on dry land. Others were equipped with protection that would ensure that they were safe even in the most highly radioactive locations. Unfortunately, these two factors were rarely combined. Robots were either designed to move over the debris and wreckage, or to withstand high radiation, but few could do both. The Joker robot was one of those designed with high radiation in mind. Its official title was MF3, and it was designed by a West German company to deal with the dangerous nuclear situations. Thankfully, despite a rise in nuclear power stations in West Germany, there hadn't been much need for the robot, and the Joker was given to the police forces, tackling ordinary, non-radioactive crimes. It was here that it earned its iconic nickname. When news of the Chernobyl disaster reached the West, the Joker was one of the many machines sent over the Iron Curtain to help with the cleanup. The machine had a crane arm and tracks, which would have helped it maneuver on the roof of the building. It also had protective shielding on its sides to keep radioactive material away from the internal components. Cleanup teams wanted to lower the Joker into a neighboring area, where it could slowly maneuver over to where the radioactive debris was located, safely clearing its own path as it went. But this was deemed too slow, and officials decided to lower the Joker directly onto the debris-covered roof. Almost immediately, it hit a problem. Graphite became trapped under the robot, and it was unable to maneuver clear to remove it with its arm. While sides of the robot were protected, the underside was not. Liquidators had to go up onto the roof and try to free the robot. Even though they managed to achieve this, it was too late, and the computer system had been completely fried, and the Joker was now useless. Not long after this, officials decided it would be quicker and easier to send people up onto the roof to just clear the debris. The Joker waited there until late in the cleanup effort, when it was removed and taken to a waste site. Number 1. In a few recent news features about anniversaries of the Chernobyl disaster, there have been mentions of a battalion that long remained secret and unknown. A photo from a commemoration ceremony references this unique and mysterious battalion, and a few reports mention just how costly the disaster was to this unit. There are small scraps of recognition that the 731st Separate Special Protection Battalion have been fighting for decades. After the fires at Chernobyl were put out, there was still a lot of work that needed to be done to minimize the extent of the disaster and save the lives of countless people across Europe and beyond. This was where the so-called liquidators would come in, helping to clean up and contain the wreckage of the reactor in the weeks and months after April 26th of 1986. The 731st Separate Special Protection Battalion was one such group of people, consisting of hundreds of men. Many of these did not know what they were signing up for. Almost 40 years after the disaster, there's still little known about the 731st Battalion. What we do know largely comes from a collection of memoirs published by Vladimir Anatolovich Gudov, a military reservist who was called up to help manage the disaster. How exactly the battalion formed is a mystery, because it never officially existed. In the days immediately after the disaster, there was little mention of it outside the area immediately surrounding Chernobyl. But some of those who did hear of the event were eager to help in the cleanup, and many of these became part of the 731st. But not everyone went willingly. Some men were visited at their homes by military personnel and told they needed to go back to the military registration office to double-check documents. Once they left, they were taken instead to the cleanup. Whether they had come willingly or not, nobody realized the extent of the danger they were putting themselves in. They were put to work loading helicopters with material to smother the reactor, cleaning buildings within the exclusion zone, and burying asphalt and contaminated material in unlined burial sites. The men were given minimal protective equipment, including respirators that seemed to only make it more difficult to breathe. Not realizing what they were breathing in, many men would take off the respirators to continue their work. Cleaning was done with bare hands. The men would eat meals on site, cleaning their utensils and plates in water from the contaminated Pripyat River. Originally, those in charge tried to monitor the contamination levels the men were being exposed to, but when they realized there was no way to avoid the high levels, this monitoring was abandoned. The men of the 731st Battalion were far from the only ones pulled into the liquidation effort, though. Firefighters, scientists, and military personnel from across the Soviet Union were brought in. Just how many liquidators lost their lives as a result of the Chernobyl disaster is a mystery. Even while still at work, members of the 731st noticed the effects of the radiation on their bodies. But when they later tried to receive help for radiation-related sickness, they were often told it was unrelated to Chernobyl. Their contributions would remain relatively unrecognized until decades later. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.